The golden anniversary celebration was meant to be a joyous occasion, a testament to 50 years of marriage between Eleanor and Charles, celebrated by friends and family who gathered in the opulent ballroom. The room was filled with sparkling chandeliers, polished silverware, and the warm murmur of laughter. Champagne glasses clinked, the clatter of utensils on fine china accompanied by the soft hum of classical music. But beneath the glamorous surface, something darker was simmering. As the evening wore on, Eleanor stood at the center of the room, surrounded by guests who waited in anticipation for her toast. Her poised figure, draped in a gown of deep emerald green, seemed to exude an air of calm. But those who knew her well could see the flicker of something unsettling in her eyes. Eleanor was never one to make a scene, at least, not until now. With a practiced smile, she raised her glass, the glitter of her diamond necklace catching the light as she did so. The room fell silent, everyone turning their attention toward her. Charles, standing by her side, appeared effortlessly charming, his broad smile and easy laughter betraying no sign of the tension brewing just beneath the surface. He had long been the picture of the perfect husband, the doting partner who had, for decades, been the epitome of devotion. 50 years, Eleanor began, her voice steady but laced with an underlying tension that even the most unobservant could sense. 50 years of love, laughter, and memories shared between us, a milestone so few have the honor of reaching. Her gaze lingered on Charles for a moment longer than expected, and the smile on his face faltered, just slightly. But love is not always what it seems. Sometimes it is a web of secrets, the threads of which unravel when we least expect it. Sometimes, we discover things about those we think we know that challenge everything we thought we understood. The room grew still. Eleanor's words hung in the air, and Charles's eyes narrowed, the tension between them palpable. What was she implying? Was she about to expose something in front of everyone? Eleanor's smile never wavered as she took a sip of her champagne, the silence lingering in the air like a charged storm cloud. Guests exchanged nervous glances, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted. What was supposed to be a celebration had suddenly become something else entirely. Charles, though outwardly composed, could not hide the flicker of panic in his eyes. He had lived a life built on maintaining control, on crafting a facade of perfection. And now, with Eleanor's cryptic words hanging over him, that carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. "I propose a toast," Eleanor continued, her voice now laced with an almost biting edge, "to truth. May it always find its way to the light, no matter how deeply it is buried." She raised her glass once more, but this time, Charles's hand did not reach for his own. His eyes remained fixed on her, the weight of unspoken words between them palpable. The room waited, hanging on the precipice of what might come next. As the toast ended, Charles chuckled nervously, raising his glass in a gesture of politeness, but the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Eleanor's words had touched a nerve, and while his outward demeanor remained confident, inside he was starting to unravel. The party resumed, but the energy had shifted. Whispers circled the room, the guests unsure of what they had just witnessed. Had Eleanor just hinted at something far more sinister than anyone had anticipated? And if so, was Charles implicated in whatever dark secrets she was alluding to? Eleanor, however, remained calm, almost serene. She observed the scene around her with a quiet intensity, her eyes sweeping across the guests. To any onlookers, she appeared the picture of grace, but beneath her composed exterior, the wheels of a long brewing plan were turning. She had waited for this moment, waited for years. And now, as the first seeds of doubt took root in the minds of those present, Eleanor was preparing to make her move. Her suspicions about Charles's infidelity had festered for far too long. Tonight, the truth would come to light, no matter the cost. The evening continued, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Charles's smile seemed more forced, his laughter less genuine. He moved through the crowd, engaging in light conversation with colleagues, his face an impassive mask. But even his most casual interactions seemed hollow, and Eleanor could see it in the way his eyes darted around the room, like a man trying to outrun his own past. And then, as if on cue, the first domino began to fall. The evening had once shimmered with the excitement of a golden anniversary celebration, but now, the sparkling chandeliers and fine china felt like a mere backdrop to the undercurrents of tension that filled the air. Guests who had once mingled freely now exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to navigate the growing unease that seemed to hang over the room like a heavy fog. Charles, ever the picture of confidence, floated through the crowd, his laughter ringing out like a practiced melody. He had perfected the art of being the center of attention, the charming, successful man who made everyone feel at ease, who turned every conversation into a performance of warmth and wit. He was the epitome of what people imagined a loving husband should be, the man who seemed to have it all: wealth, a beautiful wife, a career that commanded respect, and a family that admired him. He moved seamlessly from one conversation to another, a quick handshake here, a jovial exchange there. Eleanor watched him from the edge of the room, a quiet observer amidst the crowd. On the outside, she seemed every bit the proud wife, standing poised and elegant, her eyes following her husband's movements with a smile that was only half-hearted. But behind that smile, something had shifted. The years of seeing Charles as the ideal partner, the man who had once swept her off her feet, were now distant memories, replaced with an unsettling awareness of the truth. Charles, to the casual observer, appeared utterly at ease. His polished, well-rehearsed persona was on full display as he charmed colleagues, friends, and family alike. The ease with which he navigated the room, the effortless way he engaged with people, made it all the more difficult for anyone to see what was truly going on beneath the surface. He had played this role so many times before that it had become second nature to him, so much so that even he might have started to believe it. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen the cracks in his facade for years. The long nights at the office that he swore were just work, the late-night phone calls that always seemed to be cut short when she walked into the room, the sudden and unexplained absences. At first, she had brushed it off, convincing herself that she was overthinking things, that she was being too sensitive. After all, who could doubt a man like Charles, the successful lawyer with the perfect family? But as the years passed, her suspicions grew. The subtle signs began to accumulate, each one more difficult to ignore than the last. There had been the perfume on his shirt, the scent of a fragrance she didn't recognize, when he came home one night after an especially long day at the office. He had dismissed it, of course, telling her it was from a client meeting. But Eleanor had learned over the years that there was always a story behind the excuses. She knew him too well to fall for it anymore. She could recall with painful clarity the night she discovered the text messages on his phone. She hadn't meant to go through his things, but something about his behavior had made her uneasy. She found the message, "I miss you. Can't wait to see you again." The name attached to the message was unfamiliar, just a string of numbers. She had confronted him, of course, but Charles had played the victim, convincing her that it was nothing more than a mistake, a misdialed number, an old client trying to reconnect. But Eleanor wasn't foolish. She had seen through the layers of his lies. Something had changed, and she could no longer ignore it. As the evening wore on, Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to those moments, the moments when she had first started questioning her marriage. She thought of how easy it had been to overlook those small signs, how easily she had convinced herself that everything was fine. After all, what could a man like Charles possibly be hiding? He was the man everyone admired, the man who had always treated her with the utmost respect, or so she thought. But now, looking at him as he moved effortlessly through the crowd, Eleanor realized how deeply she had been deceived. Charles had always been good at hiding things. His life was a carefully constructed performance, designed to keep everyone at arm's length. He was the devoted husband, the successful professional, the family man. To the world, he was everything a woman could want. But Eleanor knew the truth. She knew what lay behind the mask he wore. She had watched for years as he lied, as he manipulated not only her, but everyone around him, to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. And now, it was all coming to a head. Her gaze never wavered from him. As Charles engaged in another conversation with a group of his colleagues, laughing with a little too much enthusiasm, Eleanor's heart hardened. The man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her entire life, was nothing more than a stranger in a disguise. She had spent too many years in denial, too many years holding on to the hope that he would change, that his promises of love and devotion were real. But those hopes had faded long ago, replaced with a bitter reality she could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the infidelity that hurt, it was the fact that Charles had never once been honest with her. All those years of marriage, all those moments they had shared, and yet he had never been true to her. He had betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way. And now, as he laughed and joked with their guests, he had no idea that his time was running out. Eleanor had made up her mind. She would not stay silent any longer. Tonight, the truth would be revealed, no matter the consequences. Charles paused in his conversation to take a sip of champagne, his eyes scanning the room. He met Eleanor's gaze across the room, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. A flicker of something passed between them, guilt, perhaps, or the fear that she knew more than he had ever suspected. But Charles quickly recovered, his smile returning to its familiar, confident form. He had spent a lifetime building this image of himself, and he wasn't about to let it fall apart now. Not in front of everyone. But Eleanor was no longer concerned with saving their marriage, with keeping up appearances. She had waited long enough. The suspicion, the hurt, the anger, it had all built up over the years, and now, it would all come spilling out. She would not let Charles hide behind his charm and his well-rehearsed smiles any longer. As the evening continued, Eleanor could feel her resolve growing stronger with every passing minute. She watched as Charles continued to spin his web of lies, basking in the adoration of his colleagues, his friends, and even their family. But beneath the surface, she could see the cracks. She knew what he had done, and she was done pretending she didn't. She was done pretending everything was fine. Her fingers curled around the edge of her champagne glass as she considered the course of action she had planned. There was no turning back now. The truth would come out, and Charles would have to face it. The years of deceit, of living in the shadow of his lies, would come to an end. Tonight, in front of everyone, she would finally unmask the man she had once trusted with her life. The time had come. The mask would slip, and Charles would be exposed for who he truly was. There would be no more pretending, no more lies. Eleanor was ready to make him answer for everything. The evening had taken on a tense atmosphere, the kind that weighed heavily in the air. Guests who had once laughed and toasted now spoke in quieter tones, casting sideways glances toward Eleanor and Charles. The grandeur of the event felt increasingly hollow, overshadowed by the undercurrents of suspicion that were now visibly rippling through the room. Eleanor could feel the tension mounting in her chest, but she kept her calm exterior intact. It was time. The time to confront Charles, to expose him for what he truly was now. Charles had just taken the stage to give his speech, standing tall with his hand resting on the microphone. He flashed a smile, his usual charm filling the room as he began to speak in his smooth, confident tone. The guests, eager for a celebratory moment, turned their attention toward him, but Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on her husband, her thoughts sharper than ever. For decades, Charles had played the perfect husband, the loving, supportive partner who had built a life of comfort and success. But it was all a lie, a performance. She had known it for years. Now, she was going to tear it all down. Charles began speaking about their life together, reminiscing about their early years, the challenges they had faced, and the victories they had celebrated. His voice was steady, his words carefully chosen, but Eleanor could hear the familiar falsehoods in every sentence. He painted their love story with the same gloss he had used for years, weaving a tale of devotion and happiness that was completely divorced from reality. It sickened her to listen. As Charles continued, Eleanor felt a sharp sense of clarity. The anger that had simmered in her for so long, the years of betrayal, the lies, and the deceit, everything boiled to the surface. She was done waiting, done being the dutiful wife, pretending everything was fine. Tonight, everything would be revealed. Without warning, she stood up from her seat. The motion was sudden, but it felt as though the entire room held its breath, waiting for her next move. Charles paused mid-sentence, his eyes flickering toward her. The guests, sensing the shift, went silent, their gazes drawn to Eleanor. She didn't waste a moment. "I'm sorry, Charles," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "But this isn't how it happened. Not for us. Not for me." The room seemed to freeze, the guests exchanging confused glances as Eleanor's words echoed in the space. Charles's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what was happening. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" His voice was laced with nervousness, but he quickly masked it with a forced chuckle, trying to regain control. "This is our moment." "What are you?" But Eleanor was no longer listening to him. She was no longer concerned with his carefully crafted persona, with the charming facade he had built for years. The truth had been bubbling under the surface for so long, and now it was spilling over. "The late nights, Charles," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "The hours you spent away from me, the hours you told me were for work, were never about work. You were never the devoted husband you pretended to be. You were with someone else. And I knew. I always knew." The silence in the room deepened. The guests, now entirely focused on Eleanor, held their breath. Charles looked as if he had been struck, his smile faltering, the facade of calm quickly slipping away. He took a step toward Eleanor, his hand raised as if to stop her. "Eleanor, please, not here. Not now. This isn't the time." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice rising. "This is the time. You've lied to me for years, Charles. You've deceived everyone here tonight. And I'm done pretending that everything is okay." Her words rang out in the room, leaving no room for doubt. She had been silent for too long, and now she was going to make him answer for the years of betrayal. "I remember the first time I found out," Eleanor said, her voice softening, but the hurt behind her words was unmistakable. It wasn't one big revelation, it was the little things. The unexplained absences. The texts. The phone calls that always seemed to be cut short. The perfume on your shirt when you came home late. And then there was Linda. At the mention of Linda's name, the room went even quieter. Charles's face paled, and for the first time that night, he seemed genuinely rattled. He had known this moment was coming, but he had hoped, in vain, that he could maintain his mask a little longer. Linda, his secretary, his confidant, his lover, had been the one link that tied his web of lies together, and now, Eleanor was pulling at that thread. "Linda," Eleanor repeated, her eyes locking with Charles's. "You've spent so much time with her. The dinners, the late meetings. The secret smiles. You thought I didn't notice, but I saw it all." And I knew. I knew what was happening between you two. Charles's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his face contorting as he tried to gather his thoughts. Eleanor, he trailed off, unsure of how to salvage the situation, his usual confidence crumbling in the face of her accusations. But Eleanor was relentless. The years of doubt, the pain of betrayal, had built up to this moment. She wasn't going to let him wiggle his way out of it. Not this time. You think I didn't see it? Eleanor continued. The way you'd smile at her, the way your eyes would light up when she walked into a room. You were never just colleagues, Charles. You were lovers. And I wasn't blind. I saw it all. The guests stood in stunned silence, unable to tear their eyes away from the confrontation unfolding before them. The revelation of Charles's infidelity, so carefully hidden for so long, was now out in the open. No one knew how to react. Charles, his face now flushed with anger, took a step back, his hands shaking. Eleanor, this is ridiculous. You're making things up. I've been loyal to you. I have always. No, Eleanor cut him off, her tone cold now. You haven't. You've been playing a role. And tonight, I'm pulling the curtain back on your little act. You're not the devoted husband, Charles. You never were. The words hung in the air, a truth laid bare in front of all their friends and family. The perfect marriage, the life they had built, was a lie. And now, it was unraveling before their eyes. Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor wasn't finished. She had only just begun. The room fell into a tense silence, every eye fixed on Charles and Eleanor as the gravity of her accusations began to sink in. The air was thick with discomfort, and the jovial atmosphere of the celebration had completely dissipated. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond to the unraveling spectacle before them. Some stood frozen in place, while others took cautious steps back, as if the distance between them and the couple would somehow protect them from the uncomfortable truth. Charles stood motionless for a moment, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing in futile attempts to speak. He had been caught, but he couldn't quite accept it. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this moment, some way to spin his lies, to put the mask back on and salvage what was left of his dignity. But there was no escaping this. Not now. Not after Eleanor's bold confrontation. The tension in the room grew unbearable, and it seemed as though no one dared to break the silence. But Eleanor, her eyes never leaving Charles, was not finished. The crowd waited in anticipation, unsure whether she had more to say or if the storm had passed. And then, as if to fuel the fire, Eleanor dropped another bombshell, one that would push the entire evening toward a dark and uncharted territory. I'm sure many of you are wondering where Linda is tonight, she said, her voice calm, almost eerie in its composure. The way she said it sent a shiver through the crowd. Her gaze shifted slowly across the room, meeting the eyes of the guests, who seemed to be growing more uncomfortable by the second. She could sense their unease, and it only strengthened her resolve. This was no longer about Charles. This was about exposing every last secret that had festered for too long. Charles's face twitched at the mention of Linda's name. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his hands trembling slightly. He was desperately trying to maintain his composure, but the facade was slipping fast. The mention of Linda, of her absence from the celebration, struck a nerve. The once confident man who had charmed everyone in the room now appeared smaller, his shoulders hunched under the weight of Eleanor's words. You've all heard about Linda, Eleanor continued, her voice now cutting through the air with chilling clarity. Charles's secretary, the woman who has worked by his side for years. I'm sure you've all heard the stories, the late-night meetings, the private dinners, the long hours she spent with him when I was left at home, wondering what was really going on. Eleanor paused, letting her words sink in, letting the full weight of her revelations land on each of the guests. They were trapped in her web now, caught between their loyalty to Charles and the growing suspicion that everything they had believed about this couple was a lie. "She's not here tonight," Eleanor continued, her tone becoming even more cryptic. "And it's not because she's busy with work. No, she's not here because she won't be joining us anymore. And I think some of you know exactly what I mean." The room went cold. The guests exchanged uneasy looks, the murmurs rippling through the crowd like a wave of dread. Eleanor had hinted at something far darker than anyone had anticipated. The mention of Linda's absence, so sudden, so unexplained, was like a puzzle piece falling into place. Something had happened to Linda. Something that no one, least of all Charles, was willing to acknowledge. Charles's face had drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around the room as though searching for a lifeline, but there was none. Eleanor had already taken the narrative into her hands, and now, no one was willing to back him up. The truth had been exposed, and no amount of charm or manipulation could save him from what was to come next. "I know more than you think," Eleanor continued, her voice cold and unyielding. "I've known about the affair for years. But that's not all I know. I know about Linda's disappearance. And I know who is responsible for it." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and for the first time that evening, some guests took a step backward, as though they could physically distance themselves from the accusations that were now being made. The whispers intensified, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Charles's eyes widened with panic, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had just realized the full extent of his downfall. He was no longer the man in control, the man who had orchestrated his perfect life. Now, he was exposed, his lies, his infidelities, his darkest secrets laid bare for all to see. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Charles, and she spoke with a certainty that sent chills down everyone's spine. "You all think Charles is the victim here," she said, her voice growing louder, her words taking on an edge of righteous fury. "You think he's the innocent husband, the man who's been wrongly accused. But you don't know the whole story. You don't know what happened to Linda, what he did to her." Charles's face turned a deep shade of crimson as he finally found his voice. "That's enough, Eleanor," he shouted, his voice shaking with desperation. "You don't know what you're saying. Linda is fine. She's just taking some time off. She's—" "No," Eleanor interrupted sharply. "Linda is gone, Charles. She's not taking some time off. She's gone because you made sure she never came back. You had her removed from the picture because she knew too much. She knew the truth about what you've been hiding all these years. And now, you'll have to answer for it." The crowd was stunned into silence once more. Eleanor's accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Charles's breathing was ragged, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. He knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this moment. The police would soon arrive. The evidence was there. His world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Enough," Charles finally managed to spit out. "I'm done with this. I won't stand here and let you ruin everything. You have no idea what you're talking about." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. The fear was evident now, creeping into his words, making him seem smaller, more vulnerable than he had ever been in front of their guests. Eleanor, however, remained calm. Her expression was a mixture of resolve and something else, something darker, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Charles," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "And now, you'll have to answer for it." The tension in the room was unbearable. Guests shuffled nervously, unsure of what to do next. Some of them exchanged glances, wondering if they should call the authorities, but no one moved. They were all frozen, caught in the grip of Eleanor's revelations, unwilling to act until they understood what had truly happened. The once celebratory atmosphere had dissolved into something far more sinister. Charles was no longer the confident man he had once been. The truth had been exposed, and the world he had carefully constructed for 50 years was now crashing down around him.